Hello everyone and welcome to the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative's webinar series. Dr. Janet Wilson and Frank Mullane will present Expanding the Forensic Narrative, Engaging Surviving Family Members in the Fatality Review Process. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. As you can see on the slide, we have disabled the public chat feature. If you have a question, you can type it into the box on the tab marked Room. This will open a new tab connecting you with the moderators. The moderators may not reply directly to you, but your questions will be collected. If your question does not receive a response during the session, please feel free to email us using the contact information at the end of the presentation. Please make sure your volume is turned up on your speakers. You can also adjust the volume using the bar above the video button. I'd also like to announce NDVFRI's National Conference in May of 2015 in St. Petersburg, Florida. Fatality Review, Communities and Social Change will explore the ways communities have changed their responses to domestic violence as a result of their Fatality Review work. Registration is open and we are currently accepting applications for workshop proposals. We encourage you to visit our website at ndvfri.org to download the application, learn more about the conference, and register. Our presenters today will introduce themselves as the slides advance, so I will go ahead and turn it over to Frank Mullane and Dr. Janet Wilson. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm trying to get the slides advanced, Steph. There we go. Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everybody. I am Dr. Janet Wilson, an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center in Oklahoma, and with me is Frank Mullane, the director and founder of Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Violence in England and Wales. We are delighted to be here and talking with you. We have, for some reason I'm having trouble advancing these slides, and I'm not sure why.
Dr. Wilson, can you see the page Explorer? Oh, yeah, there we go.
There we go. And it's been a pleasure that the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative in Flagstaff, Arizona is sponsoring this webinar. I'm in Oklahoma, right next door to Arizona, or 2 states away, and Frank is in England, in London. So we have a true global webinar today. And many of you from here are also from the United States or overseas, so welcome. We're going to have a conversation today about the many ways fatality review teams can expand the forensic narrative to include families of those who have died in domestic violence. I do want to say a caveat on this, is that there's no one way of doing this, and that when Frank and I talk about our own experiences, these are ideas. And it's also, we're developing our ways of doing things too in our teams, fatality review teams, so we're going to learn from you also. Frank has his website that you'll see in our slides, as well as the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative website that you can access for additional resources. We'd like to leave about a half hour at the end of our presentations, so that you can give your comments, ask questions, and say what you'd like to say, since we have such a diverse group. We welcome the diversity of this group because it's truly an interprofessional group who have signed up for this webinar, because we have attorneys, battery intervention staff, child welfare workers, community advocacy organizations, corrections, courts, culturally specific organizations, disability, DV program staff, faith-based organizations, government agency staff, mental health professionals, law enforcement, sexual assault program staff, state and tribal domestic violence sexual assault coalition staff, social service organizations, witness coordinators. And if I haven't mentioned your specific profession, I apologize, but we've had a lot of people sign up for this, and it's a pleasure that you're all here to discuss this integrating families into the forensic narrative. When Frank and I talked about how to get this together, what we thought was maybe what I do is present the Oklahoma version of how we integrate families into the forensic narrative, and then Frank would take over and talk about him developing his organization in England and the services they provide, as well as how they integrate. In Oklahoma Domestic Fatality Review Board, we are a statewide team of 18 members. We're an interprofessional team, and before we were legislated in 2001, we piloted this for 2 years. We do annual reports to the governor and the legislature. We are housed in the Oklahoma State Attorney General's office under the Victims Services Division. Leslie March, who is the Assistant Attorney General, is the unit chief of this division. And Jacqueline Stein is the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board Program Manager. Our Attorney General's office also houses all the certified advocacy centers under the Victim Services Division. Our Tribal Alliance, we also have a Tribal Alliance that organizes all the tribal advocacy services in the state. So our state is a little bit configured a little bit different than other states, as well as I'm sure we have as many versions as there are states in the United States, as well as the world. We are legislated, as I said, since 2001 to coordinate and integrate state and local efforts and collect and analyze data from all intimate partner deaths, and we were also mandated to develop a state and local database on domestic violence deaths, and improve protective services, improve policies, procedures, and practice. And we can enter into any agreements with other state and local or private agencies in order to do our job. But I think in looking at this, when we're talking about including families in the narrative, in the forensic narrative of are we collecting, one of the questions that we've been asking in Oklahoma is, are we collecting and analyzing data, family data? And are we using this knowledge to improve our protective services and policies and procedures for victims? So who are family? Families are victims of domestic violence, families of perpetrators, parents, grandparents, children, aunts, uncles, extended family of the victims, live-ins, in other words, non-biological family who are living with victims, maybe people who are very close to the victim, they're living apart but sharing a life. We consider all these people survivors of a homicide. They could be boyfriends or girlfriends. Recently, or in 2005, New York City expanded their definition of intimate partner violence, fatalities, and included boyfriends and girlfriends in their statutes. Can be communities and coworkers. One of the statements that struck me in the state of Florida's annual Domestic Violence Fatality Review Report was this: Analysis also indicated in their 2012 report a much higher percentage of family and friend knowledge about the occurrence of domestic violence prior to the homicide, which indicates to me, this I saw over and over and over in our fatality review reports, and indicates that are we using that knowledge to improve our policies and procedures and our protective services for victims. This is a wealth of information. So a little bit about the family survivors of intimate partner violence fatalities. What we know about them so far and what they tell us is that they're in a world of hurt, grief, traumatic loss. And many are trying to make sense of what has happened in the murder. And they're often thrown into a very unknown system, the criminal justice system. Or I saw in one report, in fact it was Washington State, where a family member said they really didn't want to engage with a fatality review because they distrusted the criminal justice center. So they might have had prior knowledge of the criminal justice center and they're skeptical of it. They may have been aware of and suspected serious problems between the perpetrator and the victim. They may have physical, emotional health after effects after the murder because of the stress and trauma of the murder. They may themselves have been hurt in the murder or targeted or witnessed the death event, so they're secondary bystanders. Family members are also, as documented in Washington State Annual Report, have been killed. And as I go through the annual reports in the United States, I see more and more of the family members who have been killed, along with the victims, the targeted victims of intimate partner violence. Family members also may have been isolated by the perpetrator and terrorized by perpetrators before the death of their family member. So when they've heard their family member has died, they have not been in contact with them for some time because the perpetrator isolated them. And their desire to revisit the death may or may not vary. But the question is, are we offering the option to them to revisit the death at some point in time? So the question this brings into mind for all of us who are involved in or thinking of getting involved in fatality reviews, how do surviving family members process all the above that I've mentioned, and even having an offender in their midst, and how much do they want to be involved with us in fatality reviews and in helping prevent future fatality reviews. Surviving children are members of families. And what we know too from research and our annual reports, by the way, which are online at the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative website, they're more likely to see, hear the incident. And 3,000 to 4,000 children are affected by IPV homicides annually. Besides the murder and the grief and the loss that they suffer of a parent, are the additional stressors that they'll face. Residential changes, loss of friendships, family routines, school settings are all changed and in a chaotic state. They often get lost in the aftermath of the homicide, the trial, and the trauma and the chaos. Custody may even be awarded to offenders' parents. The state of Florida in their 2012 annual report said 63% of decedents had children. Long-term adverse impacts on surviving children and the current lack of resources to address their needs make this a high priority. So in discussing family, we must also think of the children that not only witness or have been in the home or surrounded with the domestic violence and how long, and are they receiving our services as well? So what can families contribute? What do they contribute, and how are they contributing, and what do we know so far? In Pima County, Arizona's annual report, there was very typical of annual report findings and review case analysis findings. There was knowledge by coworkers and family members of the violence. So they have knowledge not only of the violence, but they also have knowledge of the victim as a person in the context of how they were living. They become sometimes the voice of the victim for us. Information that they have may not be available from other sources. That is, the way the victim tried to get help, threats to the family, systems family, how they tried to get help, but it failed. Offender tactics that might not have been known to isolate or keep the victim from leaving. They also have knowledge of the context of the relationship, the dangerous environment, and maybe even the death event. They have many ideas sometimes for ways to improve protective services, policies and procedures of agencies responding to DV victims that often professionals might not have on the Fatality Review Board. The way the Oklahoma Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board includes families are multiple. Over the years, we've interviewed families over the phone or face-to-face. Families have come to talk to the board. If a family member doesn't want to attend a board meeting and that's too intimidating for them, a family can write or record what they'd like to say and send it to a board meeting. Families have also participated in legislative interim studies that the board has arranged, and they've given valuable suggestions to improve policies, procedures, and protective services. Our board also solicits materials from families about the victims, the event. We also check for the systems or organizational contact that the family has had at times prior to the fatality, and that then is recorded or noted in a chronology that's given to board members before each board meeting. That then gives us a knowledge of what systems the family and even the victim has been involved in and ways that maybe this death could have been prevented. We've collected accounts of events and relationships from friends, neighbors, and coworkers as well. We've talked with extended family members of the victim's family that the victim's family has given us and said they were integral parts of the victim's life. We've solicited materials written by the victim, that the victim has written, diaries, for example, and we've talked with employers and coworkers. Other ways fatality review teams have included families to expand the forensic narrative. And by the way, this is not a complete list, because I'm sure I'd love to hear suggestions of ways other teams across the country are including families. Other reviews teams, however, have talked with offenders. They've talked with offenders' families. They've talked with children's grandparents, aunts, uncles, co-workers, employers, employees. The state of Maryland appoints a member of their fatality review team who has counseling or advocacy experience to talk with a family member. The Baltimore City Fatality in Maryland Fatality Review Team interviews family members, and they use an interview guide that Jackie Campbell established in her RAVE study. It's called the RAVE study or risk study, the femicide study, to determine the risk factors leading up to the event and to find out what is happening with the child survivors in order to provide family with referrals. So what are some of the thorny issues that you and we have run into over the years? Sometimes it's choosing not to contact family members, when it might be counterproductive, when it could be harmful to them, to a case. In Oklahoma, we do not review cases that have not been already adjudicated, so we're very careful about having the case already adjudicated. That may not be true with other fatality review boards, but it should. One of the issues that should be considered should be, is it wise to contact family? And you may not want to contact family at a particular point in time, or you may want to wait until later. Or the family member may say to you, no, I don't, it's too painful for me now, but it may be all right 6 months from now. Could you contact me later? So family members will have their own time frame, and they may tell you that it's counterproductive for them to be involved at this point in time. I have found that family members are very upfront in telling us what they want and what they don't want. Fatality review teams. My talk with fatality review teams over the years have told me that there's many team members fear re-traumatization of family and children, too much emotion to handle, or family not showing enough emotion. They may be judgmental and they don't want to put themselves in that position. They also fear that involving children could have adverse effects, or that the family, there could be litigation if the family points out systems families, or they're inexperienced talking with family members and they really don't think their experience would serve them well. Generally what I've found out with the teams do, they send in the most experienced members, and those members with counseling experience or advocacy experience to interview family members, and that this has worked out well. Also, I think for the Baltimore City, Maryland team has found out that by involving the families, there's more of a community involvement in let's solve the problems together with the agencies, and that it's like that we're in this together to make services better and to prevent future deaths. Family survivors are trying to make sense of the death, of a violent death, and they often tell us that they really appreciate being included. Those who don't will tell you also. Many times they become invisible in our criminal justice system agenda, and because of all the things that happen after a death, and it is chaotic, they are not heard, and they feel like their perspective, their voice is minimized. And to be sure, in going through a death of a family member, they're often stigmatized, just like in suicidal deaths. Family members say that they are stigmatized. So this has been a problem for family members that we want to reduce, yet be aware of. Some of the resources we've put on our sites, and Frank has too, and I do want to mention Verizon's Amy's story. Is an excellent video that's available on YouTube as well as from Verizon. Amy was a employee, and it's a really good portrayal of the victim's interactions with family, co-workers, and community organizations before her death. So I wanted to give you that, and Frank will talk more about his resources. And right now I'm going to hand it over the baton to Frank so he can talk about domestic violence reviews, raising the status of families and community, and his wonderful organization in England, Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Violence.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. It's about 6:30 over here in England. My name is Frank Mullane, and I direct the charity called AAFDA, or Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse. I'm in this sector because my sister Julia Pemberton and nephew Will were murdered, in fact, on this day 11 years ago. I'm slightly out of breath, sorry. Since then, I've been working to raise the status of victims of domestic violence and the status, actually, of families after homicide. I'll talk about the domestic homicide review process in England and about the charity I direct, which helps families after homicide, including with these reviews. The Pemberton Review was the pilot for the model of domestic homicide reviewing, which was being discussed in England around 2004, but did not become law until 2011. The Pemberton Review was conducted broadly, I would say, in line with the model that the law would eventually adopt, and I helped to build that model. I'm also what's called a reader. There's a handful of us in this country that are sent reviews, individual reviews, to assess quite closely. And I'm also a member of the panel that then quality assures all of the reviews. And I've been since the beginning, and I've quality assured about 350 of them. In the organisation AAFDA, we have 3 specialist caseworkers. It's very small, very niche. But he's going around the country helping families with these reviews and other matters. But broadly speaking, in a very high level, what we're trying to do is to raise the status of families. Now, Professor Neil Websell made these remarks about the Pemberton Review. I'll just give you a moment to read that. The reviewers did a great job, and one of the huge services to my family of this review was that it answered pretty much all of our questions. But it was probably too long a review, and I think to get the maximum out of these reviews, we need to make them accessible. I often hear that frontline officers of many agencies really get to read these reviews, about the services they deliver, and when they're 300 pages long, the reality is not many people are going to read them. But there were some other key features to this review. The bit I want to pull out of this slide really is that there was analysis in this review. In our work with families, we often see reviews that provide great chronologies of history, but less analysis of that history. So on behalf of one family, we are just challenging, or in fact we've just challenged the chair of the review, because the review amounts to a great piece of history, some good recording of what happened, but the analysis is lacking. Giving an opinion on it, giving an expert opinion on it, giving a view based on experience and knowledge, that's what was lacking. I think if reviews are done well, then actually the process of reviewing actually becomes part of the learning. And it actually helps that learning to become embedded. Now, with regard to my family's review, the Pemberton review, let's just have a look at some of the people that were included here. I hope you can see these red arrows. Now, the secretary of the perpetrator was interviewed, and she came to the review. It was fantastic, very honest, very open. What we were trying to produce, and I'm not sure that this was always achieved, but was an environment in which people felt comfortable to come and reveal what went on in the past in order to make the future safer. The other one of interest there is the coroner. Now, he didn't get involved until after the murders, of course, but we asked for him to be included because how he conducts that inquest, in our view, can have an impact, on whether other victims are safe. But it is unusual to see the coroner included. Just going back to some of the people in here, it's not just family and friends. As you can see, it's community members too. these are the people that victims often go and disclose abuse to, and perpetrators, but of course they're not trained to know what to do with that really hot and risk information. Now, in England and Wales, we actually have reviews for every single individual domestic homicide. This is the criteria. And I think that that definition really invites us to consider do we actually know how many people die because of domestic abuse? Now, of course, there are the direct murders, but it could include suicide, couldn't it? And Professor Silva Warby, she's over in England, her figures may imply that between 4 and 10 women commit suicide every week in England and Wales because of domestic violence. Many people speculate that that figure is higher. But there are also bystander deaths, which Professor Wilson mentioned. And what about death because someone's homeless that was caused by domestic abuse, or HIV, or other ill health which perhaps was brought on by the abuse? Now, the next slide comes under the category of dull but important as we look at the mechanical process of the review. These reviews are taking place over a period of 6 months. Now that's elapsed time, if you like. They're not reviewing every day for 6 months. This is a guideline time, and obviously the criminal trial may mean that this time period is extended. Now, our work in the charity AAFDA that I direct finds that reviews don't include enough from friends and other community members. Quite often they will go to family, but not enough to the friends and community members. I recently heard of a large employer which declined to be involved, and I think that needs to be challenged. There's a great deal that employers can do to increase safety. It can be one of the safest places for a victim to be in their place of employment. It is expected in the reviews that the review teams should include the voluntary sector in the review teams. Often there is great expertise in these teams, and also they're often very much closer to the people that are experiencing domestic abuse, and they hold a lot of experience and knowledge that can really help the review understand the compromises the victims face and start to look at this problem not from a statutory services provision sort of angle, but from a human angle. What is it like to experience abuse and to try to get out of that relationship? Now, the reviews over here, there's an assumption that they will be published unless there are compelling reasons not to. One of those compelling reasons could be that it's perceived children will be victimized or in danger. And we've helped several families on this matter, both to get a review published when the authorities did not want to publish it, and also to prevent publication when the authorities wanted to publish. Here is the process snapshot. I won't go through this in detail because you can revisit this slide. It's just a high-level slide of the process in England and Wales. In the red box, this is where the government can intervene and order a domestic homicide review to take place, and it has done that. We expect there to be substantive contact with the family. In that first box where it says that in green, I mean at the beginning of the review and also during the review. Eventually the report is shared with the family before it is sent off for quality assurance. Now, something that Janet mentioned and that reviews are leading to, which I don't think was listed as a formal purpose, is a rebalancing of the forensic narrative. Now, this is a phrase I first heard uttered by Dr. Jane Monckton Smith in Murder, Gender and the Media. Now, the forensic narrative is the narrative that comes from the court or official records, and then it is repeated in the media. Now, it becomes the official history, and then others may draw upon that history to design their services. And there was a suicide review recently, which is published. It was an excellent review. that without it, the forensic narrative would have amounted to the information that was revealed in the inquest. And the inquest was extremely short and revealed no abuse of this lady that had taken her own life. But the suicide review, using the guidance of the domestic homicide review, what that revealed was a horrifically compromised life. Now, at least that woman's history is now recorded accurately. That history of violence against women is accurately recorded. It may give hope to other people in that position to find ways out. It may give warnings to other people. But it's an accurate history, and I would have thought that if we're going to learn from history, then surely we ought to be using accurate history. Families also tell me that this accurate history is critical. Look at what this lady said on the next slide. I thought that was a very compelling quote. Still on the forensic narrative, about a month ago, a leading journalist over here in England wrote an article called "Oscar Pistorius Should Not Go to Jail." And he added, I quote, "Pistorius's life is ruined." A couple of days later, another journalist responded challenging to this, and she said, she's referring to the original article here. I thought this was very profound, and of course, what Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith has been saying is if you look back over many cases, what we are seeing are things like, I only murdered her because I loved her, or we were a couple. And perhaps if you were able to talk to the deceased person, they might say, well, actually, we're not a couple, and we haven't been for 2 years, but you perceive that we're still a couple. I want to move on, if I may, to the work that we do with families. I call it raising the status of families. We've been doing this a number of years now, and even before I set this up, families were contacting me. And what became obvious to me is that when families interact with criminal justice system agencies and all sorts of other agencies, it's quite an unequal relationship. And I think the first feature of an unequal relationship is that both parties are differently informed. So I think once a family becomes informed, their status is automatically raised, and the other party, if you like, gives them status. Now, when I use words like other party, I don't want this to sound adversarial, because I want these to be collaborative reviews in which everybody is focused on trying to make the future safer. But inevitably, we have to get some things right from the outset. So I think that the second thing that we are doing there is enabling them. That's partly by helping them become informed, but it might also be by just showing them some ways that have worked in the past to influence agencies. And for some people, we will directly advocate, and we will challenge and influence with chairs of reviews, with commissioners, with statutory agencies such as police, and we do this all of the time. Secondly, we try to help that family with a picture. I mean, this is a crazy world that people are thrust into after murder. I mean, generally speaking, these people have not, interacted with many of these agencies before. Hey, Frank, what do you mean there's an inquest? Now there's a domestic homicide review. Now there's a court trial. He's appealing. What have you? He or she, what have you? So we try to map these different processes and try to give them broad timescales of each, and we may write to the coroner, for example, and get an idea of when the inquest will be. The first response, by the way, is normally, I don't know. I haven't diarised it yet, but we go back and say, I wonder, do you have a season in mind, spring, autumn, winter? Because the family is thinking of going on holiday, and then sometimes you do get the response, Well, yes, actually, I was thinking of spring next year. So suddenly the family know that the inquest might be in the spring next year, and they're often the last people to find out. So that's the point of the map, and to differentiate current processes, to help the family get a picture of what type of review is doing what is its purpose, and what are the timescales happening. We try to help the families become integral to the process if they want to. Our purpose is not to put on the families what we think they should do. It's to show them futures, show them things they can do. They choose, and then we will help them achieve that future, achieve that position if we can. Obviously, we'll answer questions, help get them information. By being integral, of course, that means influencing at the beginning of the review. It might be in the scope. You know, you should go here, you should go there, you should interview that person. We will also accompany people in meetings, for example, to meet the panel. I think one of the most important points on this slide is about managing expectations. Over-promising, telling people things that simply aren't going to happen is one of the biggest disservices that is often done for families, and I have to say that it's sometimes done by some agencies, not because a bad thing is meant by that, but I just think sometimes people are unsure what to do, and they may over-promise as a way of getting out of a difficult situation. We also provide that help from peers, i.e. people that have had murder in their family, although one of our caseworkers hasn't, but we always allow the family to have access to someone that has. Knowing the facts, I'll just let you read that. This is a really, really critical need for many families, and families will sometimes suspend every other activity until they do this. In England, we have the Hillsborough families bravely fighting for 23 years still in order to find out the facts about the deaths of their loved ones. Strangely, the state doesn't always come forward and say, hey, let's help you find the facts. It often takes families and advocates to dig deep to try to have information revealed to them. As this lady said, you know, I feel responsible for knowing the history. There are exceptions, and I've had conversations with people, chairs of reviews, for example, that have come across difficult information, and they may make decisions that it may not be appropriate sometimes to share information. Look, both decisions may be right, and without going into detail, I've come across decisions in which you could make the call either way. When something is rather sensitive, perhaps it wasn't key to the homicide, and maybe that information, the deceased person is entitled to have it rest with them. Now, BASPACAN is the British Association for the Study of Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. They did some research which you can Google and find an executive summary for, and they talked about these 4 phases of family involvement. I wouldn't take this as too prescriptive, because sometimes I like to think that the 4 phases could meld into one if you help someone be integral. But I do think that the second bullet point there, the first contact, is key. I mean, that's just true in so many things of life, isn't it? If that goes wrong, then people are lost for the future. I just want to talk about the difficult issues which Professor Janet Wilson also talked about. Now, with emotion, I asked one review team that the sister of a man who'd been murdered, she wanted to meet the panel, and they were initially reluctant for this to happen, and one of them said, well, look, the family might get upset. Well, that's what happens after murder, and I think it's important that review teams bear witness to that. Of course, many of them will have seen horrific things as professionals anyway, but I think it's important that we continue to believe that, and understand that emotion forms a valid part of a review process. Incidentally, the lady's opening line when she met that panel was to thank them for all their hard work. I have to say that what followed was some of the most jaw-dropping honesty from officials, professionals that I had ever witnessed. It felt very human all of a sudden, as if the official cloak had gone and we began to witness a real exchange and some real disclosures, including, by the way, the unsureness of professionals and the difficulties they faced. Now, I can tell you the effects on that lady and her brother, who also attended, were significant, but not only on them. They then said that they were able to write to the rest of their family, who also gained some form of catharsis from that kind of disclosure and honesty. I would hesitate to say healing, because I think that's more complex and we need more research. But I would say that sometimes there is some kind of comfort achieved when there is truth and honesty in the room. Re-traumatisation is a difficult one. We are able to refer families to trauma therapists as part of the services in England and Wales. But I want to talk about some other aspects. Professor Moore, who I heard speak when I came over to America recently, talks about how children are often told not to speak of that big bad thing in their lives, and how that actually builds trauma. And then if you think about the victim, who often wasn't given space, Professor Liz Kelly talks about giving space for action. Well, that victim's space was narrowed, her options were narrowed. So why would we try to do that for families too? Now, the name Saldana, sorry, that's the name of a nurse in England, Jacinta Saldana, who committed suicide after she inadvertently revealed information about the royal family over here to some journalists who were kind of spoofing or something. What the Prime Minister over here, David Cameron, said was that what the family need now are the facts of the case. And thank you, Mr. Cameron, because I now quote him everywhere when we meet obstructions. Because absolutely, if you deny people information, I would say that that is one way that you can traumatize people. And I have to say that sometimes the behavior of agencies causes trauma as well. And I would go further and say that some of the authoritative and controlling behaviors that I have witnessed from some agencies are not a million miles away from some of the behaviors of the abuser that took their loved one's life. Now, of course, we absolutely meet terrific officials too. I want to be balanced, of course. Now, there is also, families report catharsis and feeling useful following that powerlessness that they may have experienced prior to the homicide and immediately afterwards. And if we go down the route of thinking that, oh, we can't talk to families as a risk of re-traumatizing, then we may only end up with professionals' views, which, as good as they may simply be incomplete. I just want to talk about, for me, what are good reviews, and I think there's so much invested in this word humility. The best definition of the word humility that I've ever come across when I started to study this was the one used by the 12-step addiction program, which I imagine most people are familiar with. And they talk about the willingness to become teachable, to be taught something. But I also think it's about revealing the truth. But not just revealing the truth, and as I think Gandhi defined it, it's not just about revealing the truth, it's about being willing to do something with that truth. I think making these reports, when I say report, sorry, the report that comes out of the review, a physical document or an electronic document, they have to be accessible, so they have to be concise. Now that doesn't mean be short, it simply means say everything you need to say, but at least say it economically. That doesn't mean exclude about the family. We have to, in my view anyway, I think there needs to be some kind of story. A set of key facts and a set of recommendations will simply not be read by people, but stories are read by people. But they need not to be overlong, Critically, I think that they reveal the compromises of victims, and that's a term I heard Professor Neil Webster use many years ago, and it always struck me really profoundly that it brilliantly describes the difficulties that domestic violence victims have. They are trying to stay alive and trying to live a life while constantly having to make compromises in order to stay alive, or sometimes just in order to get through the next day. The reviews, of course, need to lead to change. So families like to, and this again is going back to them being integral, sometimes want to hold the agencies to account. So we don't just want to see this review go onto the shelf. It needs to lead to some improvement. Now, it could be continuous improvement. I think I'd be wrong to analogize this to Ellen Pence's health safety audits. But what sometimes reviews do remind me of is that we see all sorts of, not just major things found in the review, but micro sort of stuff. You know, this guy fills this report out, but he doesn't give it to the other department, so they don't know she's still at risk. And we see all sorts of things like this. And if that is being fed back in and changed, we are seeing a continuous improvement loop, which I feel confident would be helping victims. I just want to refer on to a review into the needs of families bereaved by homicide. In this case, I think this is one of the biggest reviews of families after homicide ever done. Louise Casey was our ex-commissioner for victims and witnesses, and she conducted this research, over 400 families. But look at that conclusion. That really is quite extraordinary to say that it's as traumatic as the bereavement itself, but it doesn't surprise me. And there are so many families. One family told me how they had to clean the blood up from the house where their mother had been murdered by their father. They had to clean the blood up. It was left for them to do. Isn't that extraordinary? Now, the charity that AAFDA that I direct, this is slightly aspirational in that we want to become an information centre for DHRs. If you go on the website now, perhaps I'll disappoint you slightly, but all ideas welcome. And we want to become a members forum for chairs. We do work with families direct and indirectly, of course. Many organisations and chairs contact us for information for the family, which we will then route to them. And we have these international connections in Australia, Canada, and America at least. This is just some of the feedback that we've had. That last quote, if I could just refer you to that, please. That one is important because that family did not want the review published, and it is not published, but it would have been if they hadn't had our help. So it's very important to have a team around the family, just like there is a team, you know, agencies have access to resources. Why shouldn't families? And the lady that met the review panel that I referred to earlier said this. Ironically, she's the only person I've ever, the only family person that I've ever known use that word closure, but she didn't. So, and there we go. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions now. So you can feel free to submit your questions and comments into the chat box on the tab marked Room. We do have some questions that have come in. One of the questions was related to how reviews are conducted in England and Wales. It sounds from what Frank was saying like these reviews take place before adjudication is complete. So the question is, first, is that accurate? And second, have there been any problems related to litigation about new information or other complications that arose from that? As Frank Mullane is aware, our reviews in the United States tend to function very differently, and we use sort of that adjudication and the closing of the case as a marker to begin a review.
Is this for me to answer?
Yes, sorry.
I beg your pardon. I didn't hear all of that, but I think I got the gist of it. The review does start here before the criminal trial, but it is usually pended until after the criminal trial. However, there are exceptions, and we have been allowed to meet family members who is also known would be witnesses, although that's quite restricted, quite rightly so. So we will engage with what we call a senior investigating officer to work out who we can see. But typically, what I see most often is that the reviews are pending until the criminal trial is over. However, of course, people can appeal. Now, it's just been decided that the criminal trial is not an unreasonable point at which to decide, okay, it's over now, but there will be a percentage, of course, that may go to appeal. So before the trial, there is usually a restriction on who can be spoken to, quite rightly because of what we call disclosure rules that would then have to be revealed in the court. I'm not aware of, not aware of litigation that has come to the end. I'm aware of one or two challenges. But generally speaking, review starts within about 1 month of the homicide. That's the statutory guidance. It might be 2-3 months in reality, but typically they try to start. And so one of the key reasons that they might start that quickly is they say to the agencies, please secure your records. So, secure them as they are now, so that when you come to do this review after the trial, that we can state those were the records. So that's what's very important. Has that at least partially answered the question?
I think so. If the person who posed it has additional questions or needs clarification, please feel free to write that into that chat box. I believe this is a question for both of you, and it involves the modes of contact. So what sorts of methodology do you use? Do you find letters to be effective, telephone calls? How do you conduct that outreach, and what do you think is sort of the best way to go about doing that?
Jenny, are you speaking first?
No, I'm never speaking for you, Frank. But I'll speak first. I think that in our Fatality Review Board, we use several methods, and it really is dependent upon the case. That we might call or write a letter, or sometimes we'll solicit the information from, now that we have websites, very often families are publishing stories about their loved ones on the website, so we also solicit that. And the contact is very important. I think in our Fatality Review Board too, we choose people who have experience with interviewing and trauma, and usually that's counselors, mental health counselors, and the advocates. Frank?
The main method used is by letter, but of course that has difficulties. We have been asked to contact families on behalf of review teams, and we've just been doing that recently. Sometimes the police, well, typically in fact I think the police are asked to perhaps deliver that letter face-to-face to the family. That sometimes works quite well, because usually they're the only people that have all the information about the family. Locational type of information. However, that can also be problematic because some people won't engage with the police, or they may perceive that there was a problem with the police in the lead up to the homicide.
We have an additional question that's related to the previous one about written protocols. And I think this is both for our presenters as well as anyone in the audience who has written protocols that they may be willing to share. If your team does have such a document and you would be willing to share it with our organization, please let us know and I'll follow up with you. But if Dr. Wilson and Frank could perhaps address the issue of whether or not these protocols are actually written down, or if it's more of a practice that you've implemented over the course of years.
With our board, it's more of a practice that we've implemented, that we don't have an SOP or standing operating procedure. And we're just talking about that now, and if we even want to do that, because one of the things we've experienced, or I have experienced being on the board, is that the case sometimes determines some of the procedures. But that being said, I've also talked to other teams at the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative conferences, and they are developing standard operating procedures, and certainly there's an advantage, for example, developing an interview guide that seeks out, like the Baltimore City team does, that seeks out what's happened to the children, and then can offer more services for them to get them in the loop. So I think it's a conversation that we'll continue having in Oklahoma, and I'd like to hear what other people are doing also around the country and in England.
Yes, we have statutory guidance which at a very, very high level prescribes an approach, but that's very high level. We've also had national training rolled out to many of the people that are responsible for chairing these reviews, which has also included ways of working with families. We also have some suggested questions, but I do think this is an evolving practice. One thing I would say, there is some kind of common sense humanity to this. If you're going to engage with a family, I think on balance, one of the most critical things that you should do is acknowledge the homicide, you know, as a very early part of your introduction to them. You won't always be thanked for that, but I think that it is so critical that you do that. It's unthinkable to think that you wouldn't, and I am aware of cases where that hasn't been acknowledged, and it can cause difficulty.
I also, to add to that, Frank, I also talked with a team in Florida last year who said that they were beginning on a county level, their team, and they had developed a operating procedure and said they were using it like just kind of like a guideline. It was more, instead of an operating procedure, like a guideline, and they found that helpful. And then I asked them, I said, are you bringing family members in? Because it could be, as you develop this idea of having families more included, that we tap on their knowledge of families who have been through this and ask them, this is what we're thinking of doing. What is your idea? What do you think we should do? And I liked that they were doing that. But again, in Oklahoma, we're still discussing how and we've done it case by case so far.
Janet, one of the problems I think is that some review teams see inclusion of families as being an interview with the families. Now that's what I call involving someone. Helping them become integral means that you will meet them more than once, very probably, and you will certainly interact with them more than once. And when you do it on that basis, that opens up the opportunities to include what you said, is to invite the family to talk about the shape of the review, how they might contribute, what they want to contribute, as well as some, you know, imaginative questions from the chair. So I think if we make or give the opportunity for families to be integral to the process, I can almost visualize this review in time to come, where the family almost run the review, or one side of the review, where the agencies perhaps will be interviewed by the family. And again, after all, you know, in a crude sense, that, you know, one aspect of democracy will be, you know, people that use the services, designing the services, and holding to account those that are currently delivering them. So I think that we can be imaginative about this. But once we perceive that families can be integral to processes rather than just involved, we automatically open up the possibility of a more enduring relationship, which will automatically open up more opportunities for engagement.
Well,
we also have a question regarding the interviewers used. So someone was wondering, do you use the same interviewer for each family member contacted, or do you have multiple interviewers?
In England, I think that it's slightly different because there will be a review for each individual domestic homicide, and there will be a chair appointed. There will be a local commissioner who will say, look, we're going to have a review. I'm going to pay you to run this review. You're the chair. And that chair, usually that chair, will be the person that interviews the families. Now, many of these chairs conduct many reviews, so over time that they will have been a person who interviews many family members. But sometimes, because there are multiple family members, they may not be the person that interviews all family members. For example, in some families, not everybody may agree on certain things, and it may be sensible that there are different interviews in those situations. I finished talking on that one.
Dr. Wilson, did you have a response for that as well, about how you structure who goes and actually talks to these people, or whether you bring them to the board, how many interviewers actually sit on your team? Okay, well, I think we'll try to take a few more questions. You can still feel free to be able to type those in. I think we may have lost Dr. Wilson for just a moment, so hopefully she can get back on. But we did have a question for Frank as well. Frank, do you always refer people to services when they participate in these homicide reviews? You said that you had services available for traumatization.
Yes, that's a good question. So I think it's really, really important that anybody that works with a family realizes that not one single agency has everything that the family may need. In fact, they may not even want our services once we interact. I mean, that's never happened, but it's possible. So we certainly consider referring people to trauma therapy, make them aware it's available. There are all sorts of other services. There's something called, I don't like the title, but it's a wonderful service called Escaping Victimhood, and they run these fantastic courses where family members go and they learn about coping methods and future lives beyond murder. And I hear the most wonderful feedback. I haven't actually been on myself yet, but I know many people that have. There are all sorts of services. We also have a national homicide service that helps families with many practical matters. It's like having another form of advocate. AAFDA is quite niche, but we have this more generic homicide services which does some magnificent work with families. And there are other charities, for example, that might have different specialisms that we would refer people to. But yes, there are all sorts of services. There is a certain amount of free legal advice, for example, both that we provide to families via a barrister, but there's also a legal service that we can help families tap into for some limited free advice.
This is Janet again. We also have trauma-based services, and I think across the country in the U.S. it has been a really good movement to train therapists as well as the advocates in that model. And that's been very helpful. We also have advocates going into the courts with victims, and advocate services certainly could look at, not only in our state, I mean across the country, the range that they could help with the families as well. Of course, funding is always a source of problem because of there have been so many victims across our country that our shelters are overwhelmed. But I think the focus has been on trauma-based services has been extremely important, not only for the victims, surviving victims, but also for the families.
Thank you to both of you for answering that. We had another related question that's a little outside the scope of this particular webinar, but people were curious about interviews with perpetrators and what your experience has been there.
I have not interviewed a perpetrator. However, in England, in these reviews, it is expected that chairs of reviews will at least consider interviewing those perpetrators. And I know many chairs and of many reviews in which the perpetrator is interviewed. You know, there are good practices around that too. Which I won't go into detail here, but about, you know, obviously making sure that person has some support, etc. But that actually means chairs of reviews, of course, going into prison. And sometimes in the reviews we will see the statements, actual quotes from the perpetrator. So it is in our guidance for our reviews. We believe that what we are trying to do is make the future safer. And so in order to make the future safer, you need to talk to whoever might be able to help you do that. And perpetrators will have a perspective that may help us understand why people did certain things, why they chose certain paths. Critically, what services, and maybe it amounts to speculation, but what services might have prevented them from committing homicide?
In Oklahoma, we may get perpetrator accounts, of course, in the police reports. We do get that, but we don't interview them. But the Montana team, and Matt Dale talked about that, about interviewing perpetrator families last month, and that may give us more information than we think on prevention at earlier childhood levels, and what we can do in our schools. Usually, I'd like to hear from some of the teams out there if they do interview perpetrator families or perpetrators, but generally speaking, we don't in Oklahoma.
I'd just say, actually, yes, thanks, Janet, for reminding me there. I don't see very often reviews speaking to the families of perpetrators, but I do occasionally. Sometimes there are difficulties, but what's interesting is I don't think there are many services for the families of perpetrators, and of course they are innocent too.
Thank you both for that. That's a really good point. We did have one person who commented that he would strongly advise not to interview a perpetrator one-on-one. He says that they can still remain very manipulative, and you need someone to deflect this and keep the interview on track. So I thought that was a good piece of advice as well. We had another question about encouraging family and friends to participate when they're suspicious of an agency due to the way that the process unfolded. So if you have any comments on that, we would love to hear them as well.
Yes, I would say it's completely natural for persons to be suspicious of agencies. What's wrong with that? What I think that engagement with those agencies can do, if this is their opportunity to provide an improvement in that perspective. Can I put it that way? That sounds really crass, but that's how I perceived it sometimes, even in my own experience when we had real difficulties with police, that over time they were able to show us things and evidence things that, you know, improved our perspective somewhat. So I think it is an opportunity for the agencies to create a better relationship between the state and the people those state agencies, are charged with protecting.
That's very important, Frank. That the working with the families really is an opportunity for us to strengthen the community relationships rather than disassemble them. I think it goes a long ways when families know what's going on, because very often they don't even know that there's a fatality review team that's looking at the case of their daughter or son or whatever's happened, and they're often gratified to see that the community wants to do better and wants their input on how to do better. So I think that's an important point. I have heard from teams where one team in the West where they said that the family would not participate because they had prior criminal justice dealings with the criminal justice system, meaning that the family's been in trouble with the criminal justice system. And that was a factor that they hypothesized why they would not participate. Therefore, they didn't want, in other words, the family didn't want to call attention to prior relationships with the criminal justice system, which could be a factor. But go ahead, Frank.
We helped one family, Janet, forgive me, Janet, sorry, we helped one family in which, there was some history, but the police had come to conduct the interview, and the family wouldn't say much, and I think there's some sort of logic there, isn't there, that, if there's a bit of history, perhaps the police, with all respect, might not have been the best agency to conduct that interview. But I absolutely feel quite passionately that because these reviews are trying to make a future safer, that as you so nicely put that, Janet, building that safer community, that trust, if it can be achieved, it is just so important. And so these are really an opportunity for agencies to begin to do.
And having experienced that, because Oklahoma is, now we're getting to be a veteran board, we have seen relationships over the years that have been disassembled because of controversial cases, which I'm sure we all know of. But if a fatality review team has an intention to build the relationships rather than perpetrate the disassembling, I've seen that work where law enforcement, social services, healthcare have come together to say, okay, how can we do better? And I think that has to be a intention of a board to do in their philosophy as they develop. And I know some of you out there are just developing your boards, some are new ones, some are old ones like we are. And we constantly have to think of what our philosophy is, what our guiding principles are in our philosophy, and what our intentions are in doing these reviews.
Yeah, look, I think in the same way that maybe some exchange of comfort takes place when a family sits down as professionals that are being honest, disclosing their own unsureness about things, some kind of vulnerability, what have you. You've got that on the one side. But when you do meet somebody who's disingenuous or over-promises and then does not deliver, I'm afraid, there's all sorts of negative effects that are going to cut in. It's going to reinforce mistrust. So I think that, review teams must realize that not only is the review itself critical, but this is an opportunity for building trust in the community.
Thank you both. We had another question, since we're sort of talking about this concept of expanding the forensic narrative. From your perspective, how far back in a lifetime should a review look?
The reviews, and I've read about 350 of these reviews, they vary enormously how far they go back. Some will go back 30, 40 years. Some will go back to the period of the beginning of the relationship, maybe a year or two. I think the guiding factor is if you're going to go back 40 years, then you need to pick out the key factors from that are relevant. Because if you populate reports and reviews with information and chronology that is not going to be really key to the homicide, then arguably you're introducing a wood for the tree scenario, and you're going to reduce the effectiveness of that review. So I think it's a case of being guided by the importance of knowing that you have to produce something that is accessible, that's going to lead to change. And if you have those guiding factors, and you are going to go back far, then you need to be quite precise about that, I think. Otherwise, you know, we are talking about limited resources here, for which there may be other demands too.
Yeah, I just want to back up what Frank was saying, that we go back as far as we can, and we're fortunate to get a lot of information from various agencies through our legislation. But families will often expand that narrative to way back. And some of the things coming out of the World Health Organization lifespan model are very instructive for us, saying that what occurs in childhood affects adulthood, affects older adulthood, and that we need to consider looking at this process not just at one point in time, but over a lifespan. And how we then, how we reframe our preventive services to include this lifespan perspective. I think that often we just take an event as if it's static, and this, the family and the victim, the murder, is not static at all. And this has been going on for some time in some form or the other, either coercive control. And we see in our reviews that there's a segment of our reviews of the people who have been murdered that have no contact with any of our social services, healthcare services. They are what we call under the radar. So how do we get to this group also is a question that we have to consider. So families can give us that longer term perspective that often is not there when we're so intent on the reports surrounding one static event rather than getting a whole chronology. That's one of the things we do in Oklahoma that's very time consuming for our staff, and is developing a chronology for the board over the years so that they can see this spanning approach, and how the different agencies can start thinking about the services that they're delivering to different age groups. And we have to start sooner. So we started looking at dating violence grants and grants in elementary schools to teach children about bullying and relationships and fairness in relationships.
Yeah, I really agree. I really agree with that, Janet. And I know Neil Websdale will sometimes use the term "find the trail of pain." You know, that these things pretty much always do not come out of the blue. There may be exceptions, but usually there's some kind of pattern of control, or there is a trail of pain, or a trail which actually is evidencing that a person was unable to access services because they were so isolated or so controlled. So as you quite rightly say, go back as far as you can, but what I have difficulty with sometimes is when the resultant reports then may include everything and expect others to extract the relevant learning. And I think that's the risk of overlong reports that include everything. They need to do the work to make it more concise and make it accessible for others to learn the lessons.
You know, every time I talk with you, Frank, I love the balance that you give to this field. We do have to seek a balance in it, because you can go to the extremes, you can not accurately report, and I think that's kind of the message that, you know, I see the learning lesson in this work that we do, that we've got to see things. How can we be aware of the reality of what happened?
Yeah, and could I just quickly add, please, that don't just think about family, think about friends. You know, some people don't tell their family these things. Some people have moved away from their family for 20 years and then been murdered. You know, friends are holding information, employers, friends. These people often have hot information. I don't see enough of those people being spoken to in reviews.
Thank you to both of our presenters so much. And that last comment, I mean, all of these sort of philosophies and strategies that we've discussed today could certainly apply to including family members as well as friends, co-workers, neighbors, really moving from the life of the victim and looking for places to gather information in that way. So again, just thank you to both Frank Mullane and Dr. Janet Wilson. As we close, I would just like to mention that everyone who registered will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to an evaluation survey. I hope you'll take a few minutes to fill that out, as we do use those to improve our future events as well as educational opportunities. We did record this webinar today, and we are currently exploring the best way to house those recordings. If you did register, you will receive an email with instructions when we determine how to house the library. The next webinar in this series will take place on December 9th. Alicia Aiken, Executive Director of the Confidentiality Institute, will provide insights on navigating confidentiality issues in fatality review. A registration link will be provided in that follow-up email. And you can see our contact information on the slide. I do encourage you to explore our website to see what we have available, as well as taking a look at our Family Violence Institute website, which is posted at the address at the bottom of the slide. The National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative is now housed in the Family Violence Institute at Northern Arizona University. So thank you all so much for coming today and for your participation. You asked wonderful questions, and I really hope that everyone learned a lot, both from the presenters and from each other. Thank you, and have a great day.